Hey everyone, welcome back to ThursDev. I'm Luke, and this is another game design breakdown. Stealth action. The genre name tells the story of exactly what you should be expecting going into one of these games. An action game that focuses not on fighting your enemies head on, but moving quietly, striking lethally, and fading back into the shadows before you can be seen. The genre itself dates as far back as Hideo Kojima's Metal Gear from 1987, where the player takes the role of a soldier named Snake that has to hide around corners and behind objects to avoid being seen by enemy troops as they make their way through the extremely dangerous secret base of Outer Heaven. It put an emphasis on smart avoidance of enemies as opposed to stand-up fights that had defined the action genre previously. As an entirely new style of action game, it was branded tactical espionage. When the video game landscape made the shift in the late 1990s to 3D, it would introduce a difficult new challenge in the creation of stealth gameplay. Kojima's Metal Gear was presented top-down with a full view of the screen and enemy positions. The enemy looks directly forward and could see for a set distance that, with practice, the player could learn how much space in front of and to either side is safe to walk around. In 3D, the player no longer had that luxury of seeing the position of every enemy on the map. That was even one of the more compelling issues with stealth games in 3D. There could be anything around any corner. This challenge alone would have been enough, but the player also couldn't always tell if the location they were in was even concealed or not. This inability of the player to know if something could see them would have led the player to be unprepared for incoming attacks, and ultimately lead to frustration and abandonment of the game if they were unable to tell if their stealth was effective or not. Enter Takuma Endo, founder of Acquire Corp., a company I once worked for, and his game Tenchu Stealth Assassins. Pitched as an entry to a game design contest held by Sony Music Entertainment, the game put the player in the tabi of a ninja in feudal Japan, sneaking around beautiful estates, castles, and forests, and assassinating enemies not through direct combat, but through guile and ambush. With a powerful grappling hook that allowed the ninja to easily travel up onto roofs and therefore into various good hiding spots, the player was able to survey a large area, plan a kill, and execute their foes with ruthless efficiency. You're planning where you can set down a poisoned musubi that some gormless guard will pick up and eat, putting them out of commission, but lo and behold, sometimes you wouldn't have even known that the villager was there, and that was on you because you didn't scout around well enough. But perhaps you did know that they're there, but you had no idea that they could see you or that they were close enough to detect you. For this, we have the detection meter. A quick breakdown of the meter's form and function. The detection meter is a UI element that's either persistent or contextual, depending on the game, that has various visual states to relay to the player whether they're currently being detected or not. When an NPC, that's non-player character, detects the player, the NPC relays that detection status back to the game, which then updates the detection meter. The meter doesn't have any direct influence on any other mechanics. It's purely reactionary and only functions to relay to the player that they're currently being detected and therefore should be extra cautious and attempt to find a way with which they can escape detection, or they should be ready for further action from the NPC. Plain and simple, the game relays data to the player based on current state of one or more nearby NPCs. In the case of Tenchu, the detection meter, or key meter as it was referred to, meaning that the player can sense the ki or spiritual energy of nearby characters, has four major states. Undetected, but near something that may detect the player. Detected but not alerted. Alerted but not engaging in combat. And engaging in combat. And whether there were no enemies nearby at all, it was empty, where the player is completely undetected and undetectable. Not every game includes this many states, certainly, but Tenchu's is fairly comprehensive. It effectively relays to the player whether they're in any danger of being spotted, and even if they're spotted, whether they're currently identified as a viable threat or not. The UI further assists the player by telling them exactly how close they are to detection with a numeric value overlaid on the UI. As detection meters go, and understandably so as a pioneer of the mechanic, the detection meter in Tenchu is very generous with its information. It's most likely a response to the technical limitations of the platform, as the graphics processor in the PlayStation was not overly powerful, that the undetected but detectable state and the danger value were added. Modern detection meters in games like Far Cry, Skyrim, and so on typically eschew this for a simple ranges of detection meter, which only typically has two absolute states and a fuzzy border in between that serves the same purpose of our question mark, exclamation mark, and not quite interrobang. Why even relay this information to the player, though? There are a number of very popular contemporary stealth games that take a much more subtle approach to relaying detection. It isn't necessarily the most immersion-breaking thing that you can do in a stealth game, but there are certainly arguments that could be made that a game that emphasizes the tenseness of stealth should make it more difficult for the player to be completely situationally aware in this way. And though that is valid from a realism standpoint, the detection meter is a very obvious example of function over form. Understanding that in an imperfect system of relaying information, such as that of through a monitor and speakers, even the most realistic set of clues is prone to be missed by the player, and that means perceived unfairness. The ultimate point is that in a stealth game, the player wants to feel stealthy. And in a game where a player is typically unable to contort or duck lower than usual to stay below very small cover or use unorthodox methods of looking around otherwise blind corners, this impediment has to be countered in some mechanical function. In a reasonably large portion of games, this takes the form of the detection meter. And even in the case of games where the player is not given an overt UI, it's common to instead give the player a more direct means of telling whether an enemy can see them or not, by giving them some form of X-ray vision to tell them exactly where opponents are, like Assassin's Creed's Eagle Vision and Batman Arkham series' Detective Vision, which allows the player to see enemy locations even through walls, or a minimap that tells the player the direction enemies are facing and their position relative to the character, like Deus Ex Human Revolutions. So of course the detection meter serves to supplement the stealth in a general way by making up for the dulling of human senses caused by the game only really being able to guarantee vision in a small field and sound that's limited by the quality of the player's stereo system. What the detection meter does otherwise, however, is something of a more tangential but crucial part of the other most common element of the stealth action game, the stealth kill, or takedown. For those of you who aren't familiar with the takedown, in most stealth action games, though the player is significantly less effectual in a stand-up fight, they balance this out by being able to instantly defeat any enemy they attack from melee range while the enemy can't detect them. It isn't always the case that the takedown is an instant kill. Frequently it manifests as a significant increase in attack damage in the case of RPGs with stealth elements like Skyrim, but in the more pure stealth action games like Tenchu, Deus Ex Human Revolution, or Dishonored, the takedown is your most effective weapon. As these takedowns are contingent on the player being in stealth, however, that means that when stealth is disrupted, the takedown also becomes impossible. This means that even though the gauge doesn't specifically serve any mechanical function itself, without it, not only would it be somewhat more difficult to play stealthily, but the player would have significantly more trouble knowing, until the absolute last moment, if they're able to perform their takedown or not. This is counteracted, of course, by on-screen prompts in games that don't directly include a detection meter, but that closing in is all the more tense. In nearly any game that relies on stealth as a central mechanic, a method of relaying the player's likelihood of being detected, at the very least in some meaningful way, is really a necessity. Even if it's presented as optional, the game designer's on the hook for ensuring that when the player is attempting to be stealthy, they have the opportunity to know whether they're succeeding or not. Particularly in the case of a game that includes large amounts of incidental foliage like tall grass and bushes, it's imperative that the designer relay to the player whether all of the brush in front of them is actually obscuring field of view from the opponent, as it very possibly could be ignored by the game's vision calculation. As a large number of older computers were incapable of rendering things like extra grass or foliage back in the day, it would very frequently be presented as optional. But when it shows on the player's screen and obstructs their view, they're very likely to make the connection that it should block the computer's view as well. This was a huge issue in some older stealth-focused games like the original Far Cry, which allowed the player to be noticed essentially regardless of what might be obstructing field of view. So the detection meter is a band-aid all told, but it's mostly a way to relay information that's really just lacking due to the limitations of the medium. As virtual reality continues to advance and we further refine the various control schema for that particular new delivery system, it'll be interesting to see whether this convention continues to persist, or whether realism and actual use of the body in its own senses becomes more of a given. And that's it for me today. I hope you found this informative, if not interesting, and I also hope that it might help to shed a little light, or shadow, onto one of the most important but stealthy parts of the mechanics of the stealth game. Thanks very much for watching, and I hope to see you again really soon. Or maybe I won't. Take care.